Thank you all for coming to our second uh, lecture this spring in the Diversity Lecture Series. We're very happy to have you here. We're going to have, we think, a very good lecture series and continue to do this. I want to bring to your attention to remind you that we will have another lecture next week on Friday at this same time here in this same auditorium. The lecture will be by another member of the Interdisciplinary Studies faculty, Dr. Lynn Mabe. The lecture is entitled Interpersonal Communication in a Diverse World. So we look forward to seeing you again next Friday at the same time. This brings us to today's lecture by Dr. Dachang Cong, who is an Associate Dean in the School of Interdisciplinary Studies and a senior lecturer who has a specialty in American Studies. Dr. Cong came to UT Dallas in the fall of 1991 from Yale University, where he obtained his PhD and studied cultural anthropology. One of his major research interests was ethnicity in contemporary America. His scholarly work has a strong interdisciplinary and cross-cultural orientation. He has written a book and several refereed journal articles on Chinese and Amish cultures. He has conducted extensive studies on the Chinese immigrant community, which have included the roles of Chinese business and technology elite in helping reshape American business culture and transforming the Chinese world. A quote from Dr. Cong is, and it relates to the way he relates to students, and he's very popular with students, but he has said, "I encourage students to view American society as outsiders and to appreciate the great mosaic of American cultures," unquote. A measure of Dr. Cong's qualifications for delivering this lecture is the number and breadth of courses for which he has been the professor of record. And I'm going to just list some of these courses just so that you have a sense of how strong he is in this area. American Studies 3302, American Cultures. American Studies 3321, American Ethnic Experience, Immigrants Before 1945, Old Immigrants. American Studies 3322, American Ethnic Experience, Immigrants After 1945, New Immigrants. American Studies 3325, Religious Groups in the U.S. American Studies 3315, Cultures in Conflict. American Studies 3326, The U.S. in the 21st Century. Interdisciplinary Studies 3336, Culture Regions, China. American Studies 3335, U.S. and East Asia. Interdisciplinary Studies 4309, Diversity and Globalization. Master of Arts in Interdisciplinary Studies, MAIS 5300, China, Politics, Economy, and Society. International Management Studies 7350, The Politics and Economy of East Asia. American Studies 3374, Entrepreneurs in America. Computer Science 3385, Ethics, Law, Society, and Computing. Interdisciplinary Studies 4303, Business, Law, and Culture. As you can see, Dr. Cong has been the professor for at least 14 different courses, and these 14 different courses find their home in 4 different schools at UT Dallas. That is his home school, which is Interdisciplinary Studies. He's also taught courses in Engineering and Computer Science, also taught courses in the School of Management, and also taught courses in Economic, Political, and Policy Sciences. So it is my pleasure to present my good friend and colleague, Dr. Dachang Cong.
Let's see what this works. Thank you, Dr. Fair. We know Dr. Fair is one of the best leaders of the university, and now he's also the interim vice president of diversity and community engagement. I think Dr. Fair knows more about me than I know about myself. I regard that as a great encouragement. I want to say a few words about our university and our school. I came here in 1991, and I think Dr. Fair was really the host. At that time, UTD was much smaller, quieter, and but at that time, I said to Dr. Fair, I said, this is a small university one day will become a great university like UCLA. I don't know how Dr. Fair thought about that, but now we know the university is at the same rank at University of California, Irvine. So my guess is that in one generation, this university will look like University of California, San Diego. In 2 generations, I hope I can live that long. And I believe this university will look like UCLA. Because at one time, UCLA looked like UTD, just like that. But nowadays, UCLA is just as good as UC Berkeley. Also, I want to say a few words about our school. The School of Interdisciplinary Studies is a very important part of the university. We have some unique programs for our students and for the university. Now we have this new healthcare studies program. I believe this one will become one of the best known in the university. In 2 years, with Dr. Fair's leadership and Dr. Burns and our wonderful advisor, Ty Score, we already have 300 students. So I hope some of you will consider this program, and we also tell others about the program. Okay, now I will start my speech. We know Chinese Americans are the largest group of Asian Americans, and also Chinese Americans occupied a very special place in the history of Asian Americans. So I will start with Chinese Americans. In the middle 19th century, China was in a very bad shape. China lost the war, the so-called Opium War, and the British controlled Hong Kong. So South China was struggling socially and economically. There were already a lot of people at that time. So whenever there were chances abroad, young men would go to other countries. So when many young men heard of the good news of the gold rush in 1849, they thought that's the good place to go. So many of them came to California. That's almost like 200 years ago. And not many found gold, but many started all kind of businesses or did all kind of hard work. For example, many of them started small restaurants, and that tradition we still see clearly today. We have almost 30,000 Chinese restaurants in the United States. Between P.F. Chang and the Panda Express, there are all kinds of Chinese restaurants. So Chinese food is already part of the American diet, and we all know that. Chinese immigrants also started many laundromats and also grocery stores. Many hardworking laborers worked in coal mines, on farms, and then the great achievement was to help finish the transcontinental railroad. Many Chinese workers died because it is very difficult. According to one story, because that section from Salt Lake City to California was very difficult. The railroad had to cut through mountains. So very often, Chinese workers were placed in a large wicker basket, and then they were lowered to the mountainside. Then they will make a hole and put the dynamite inside, and then they ignited it. And then they would have to say, in Chinese, 快点儿 means quickly. So somebody at the top of the mountain would have to lift the basket. So many died by building that railroad. And also, Chinese immigrants grow vegetables and fruits. And the most famous one was called the bean cherries, because a Chinese peasant named Bing was the first to raise that kind of cherries. So we can find that in many places. Central Market, Whole Foods, a lot of oranges and other things. Chinese even went as far as to Texas to build railroads. They went as far as Louisiana, Mississippi to grow rice. But sometime in the 1870s and 80s, the Chinese started to face stronger discrimination against them. The US government even made a law called China Labor Exclusion Act. Basically, it tried to stop the Chinese from coming. But those Chinese who were here in America, they tried their best to build their livelihood. When they found that the outside world was too hostile to them, so they built Chinatowns. So today, Chinatowns are everywhere. We have several in the DFW, but the largest ones are in Los Angeles, San Francisco, and New York City, Vancouver, Toronto, many other places. But labor was needed by many farms and other businesses. So when the Chinese laborers stopped coming, American businesses would have to lure Filipinos, Japanese, and even a small number of Koreans. So large group of Japanese workers went to Hawaii and California. In Hawaii, they worked in the cane fields. Japan had a very unique system. That is, only the first son or the most capable son could stay on a family farm. Other sons would have to go to find a job somewhere else. So many of those Japanese laborers were the second or the third sons. They came to Hawaii. They worked hard, but after a few years, they decided to stay, and they wanted to get married. So they sent their pictures home. And relatives, go-betweens, would look at those pictures and try to find a bride for them. But obviously, not every man is handsome. So some Japanese men were afraid that they were not so handsome, or after the hot Hawaiian sun, they got a lot of tan. So that was not very good in the Asian eyes. Even today, on the campus, very often you see Asian girls, they have parasols, umbrellas, because Asians do not value tan as much as Americans. So obviously, some of those workers who are not so handsome or not so young, they borrowed the pictures of their younger and more handsome friends. And they sent those pictures back to Japan. When happy brides arrived at Hawaii, they were shocked. They would say, "It's not you." But too bad, too late. because at that time it would take quite a long time to come to America from Japan. And also, if they would go back to Japan, they'll be regarded as rejects. So those brides decided to stay. They formed families, they saved money. Eventually, they moved out of the cane fields, they started the businesses. And we know Japanese are very successful today in Hawaii and many other places. So there's a saying that much of Hawaii is managed by Japanese Americans. And then, during the Second World War, the Chinese Americans and the Japanese Americans had a very different experiences because U.S. was fighting with Japan, and China was also fighting with Japan. So Chinese Americans were treated much better. And then the U.S. government and many leaders in California, Oregon, Washington, they thought that perhaps many Japanese would work with the Japanese government or troops. So about 2 months after the Pearl Harbor incident, the U.S. government decided to forcefully relocate 120,000 Japanese to 10 prison-like camps inland. That was the tragedy, because that relocation looked like the relocation of the American Indians many years before, and also people could see the old experience of African Americans and many other ethnic groups. But in Hawaii, because there were a lot of Japanese people, it was just very difficult to relocate them. So Japanese in Hawaii were not relocated. So that was a very painful experience. And about 2.5 years later, the U.S. government decided to stop the program. And then Japanese, not everybody would go back to California. Many of them decided to settle in other places. But because of the bitter experience, Japanese Americans became the best organized Asian Americans. For many years, they were the leaders in fighting for the rights of Asian Americans in general. Towards the end of the camping experience, many second-generation Japanese Americans became soldiers, and they were sent to Europe. And the Japanese second-generation unit became the most decorated military unit in American military history. So they fought very briefly. They showed that they loved America and they were Americans. So many of those former soldiers later became the leaders for Asian American rights. After the war, many war brides came from China and other countries. We mentioned earlier that the U.S. government decided to ban Chinese laborers in the 1880s. So 60 years later, the situation for the Chinese Americans became much better. Many students came to the U.S. to study. After the communist government took control of China, many educated, rich Chinese people escaped to Taiwan and Hong Kong and other places. And then they encouraged their children to study in America. So many came to America to study. But the major change happened in the 1960s. We know that African American leaders were the vanguards of the civil rights movement, and I'd like to link that movement to the fate and the conditions of all ethnic groups, including Asian Americans. Because of the civil rights movements and its results, all the ethnic groups would see better treatment. And in 1965, President Johnson decided to transform the immigration policy significantly. So more and more immigrants could come from Asia, Latin America. Before that, Europe was the mainly place. So that was a great breakthrough. With the new reforms in immigration policies, many Asians from different countries have come to the United States. And then the next important event was the semiconductor revolution in the 1970s, and the PC revolution in the 1980s, and the internet revolution in the 1990s, and the cellular phone revolution in the last 10 years or so. Because of the needs for highly skilled tech workers, many Indians, many Chinese, and many other Asians, whether they were born here or they came to US as students or just as employees, they have played a very important role in the high-tech industry. So today, if we visit Silicon Valley, we'll see nearly 30% of the high-tech companies are founded by immigrants. And you go to any high-tech industry, any high-tech company, you will see many Asian faces. For example, if you visit Google, 4 of the 10 top executives are Indians. And then, not a long time ago, several weeks ago, Microsoft named an Indian immigrant as its CEO. So we can see that when the Chinese immigrants came to California in the middle 19th century, the situation was much harder and more difficult. And then now we have an Asian CEO in Microsoft. That's a great achievement. So now I wanted to talk about Indian Americans. Indian immigrants came to US to respond to the high-tech revolution, and American high-tech companies vigorously recruited them. We know India has a very good higher education, and for example, all those campuses of the India Institute of Technology. So they have come to the US, they work in tech companies. And many of them moved up, so we can see executives everywhere. We also know that our company, like a local, our high-tech company, our parent, TI, and we have many Indians, many Chinese, Vietnamese, and others. So Asians have played a very important role in the last 30, 40 years in the high-tech industry. So from the Gold Mountain, why Gold Mountain? Because in the Chinese language, San Francisco means the old Gold Mountain. It has something to do with the gold rush. And also, if you have been to California, you probably will know in summertime, many low hills are covered by golden grass. They indeed look like a gold mountain. And the Silicon Valley is the new gold mountain for Asians. So Asians have achieved a lot, but we know there are a lot of problems from my own study of the Chinatowns in New York and San Francisco. I found that poverty among Chinese laborers and also elderly Chinese can be shocking. We know San Francisco and New York are two of the most expensive cities in the United States. But the poor laborers from China, we are wondering how they could make a living. They work in Chinese restaurants, garment factories, and then they live in substandard conditions. Many large warehouses or top floors above the restaurants or factories were transformed into multi-units, sometimes separated by just the curtains. So they live in very crowded condition. Many older Chinese, perhaps they worked in Chinese restaurants all their lives, and now they are retired. They could be very poor or just about the poverty line. Because I know in New York City, if you are above the poverty line, you are still very poor. It's very expensive. I can give you one example. One of my sons lives in a 400 square feet apartment, and he pays $2,600 a month. So obviously he's much richer than those poor laborers or elderly Chinese in Chinatown. So that's one problem. Another problem is disability awareness, because traditionally Asian societies do not pay much attention to their disabled populations as much as the Western societies. So a lot of disability issues are simply ignored. And then that's very, very difficult. Okay, so far I have covered 3 groups, but we do not have enough time. But I want to talk about a few other groups. I want to talk about the Iranian Americans, because when we think about Asian Americans, we tend to think about the Chinese or Japanese or Koreans, Vietnamese. So basically they think about East Asia first, and then Southeast Asia. And then very few people would include West Asia or Central Asia into the consideration. But the Asian American groups indeed include many different groups. They have different languages, different cultures, but as Asians, they share certain characteristics. And also as immigrants, they share more. Iranian Americans. In the 1970s, Iranian students were the largest group of foreign students. That's hard to believe. Just like today's Chinese and Indians. And they were the best students from Iran, because at that time, the Shah promoted a pro-West policy. So many best students came to US to study. After the revolution, many of those students decided to stay in America. And because of the harsh conditions back home, many professionals, Iranian professionals, especially doctors, they decided to come to the United States. So today we probably have about 500,000 or more Iranian Americans, but they have indeed adopted American cultures very well. They are highly successful, highly educated, and the second, third generations are well represented in our medical schools. We know the co-founder of eBay. We also know the tennis ace, Agassi. So there are many famous Iranian Americans. But because they have adopted American culture so well, they do not stand out as significantly or noticeably as the Chinese. Very often, people think about Chinese Americans as not just as the largest group, but also as one of the examples. Because one reason is the existence of Chinatowns everywhere. So you always see Chinatown, you see Chinese food, so we think about the Chinese. So Iranian Americans are very successful. Another group I want to talk about is the Korean Americans. Koreans started to move to America after 1965. Many of them are highly educated. They were professionals back home, but because of the language problem, many of them could not find the similar professional jobs to what they held back home. So Koreans have become the group that is known for entrepreneurship. They started many businesses. In our region, if you get into a donut shop, you probably will see a Korean family there. The father and the mother work in the back room, and the son and the daughter or daughter-in-law who speak better English would work in the front. Very successful. Donut shops, and also many grocery stores in underserved neighborhoods, because our large chain stores hesitated to serve the poor people. So many Korean business people found a niche. They would start stores in those places. So Koreans have the highest rate of owning their own businesses. Koreans are also famous for their religious life. There are so many Korean churches, and the Korean churches are a very important part of their life. Many people spend almost every day there, especially the elderly Koreans. And the donut shops always bring donuts to those places. So it's very important. Highly organized, and the Korean parents are known to be, I will call them the super tiger dads or tiger moms, because Koreans always want to compete with the Chinese and the Japanese. They want to do better than the Chinese and the Japanese. So they are very tough parents. So the next group I want to talk about, the Filipino immigrants. The Philippines used to be a colony of Spain. And then in the late 19th century, US defeated Spain and got to control the Philippines. So Filipinos and Filipinas are familiar to Western culture. And they also speak English. That's a great advantage over the members of many other Asian American groups. In the last 30, 40 years, Filipinas have come to US as nurses because there's a shortage of nurses in the United States. I can understand why. Because to be a nurse is very difficult. They have to be very skillful. Also, we all know to work between patients and doctors is a very difficult job. So in the Philippines, there are 300 nursing schools that train nurses for America. Although it is a greater loss to the Philippines, it's a greater gain to America. They are still coming. Although nowadays we see nurses from India, from South Korea, from African countries, such as Nigeria, Kenya. But the Filipino nurses are still the largest group. We also know Filipinos have certain advantages. They speak English. Also, most of them are Roman Catholic. And also they are familiar with Western culture. The final group I want to talk about is Vietnamese Americans. We know that the Vietnamese start to leave Vietnam soon after Viet Cong took over South Vietnam. So in 2 or 3 major waves, thousands of them came to the United States. Although in the recent decades, many Vietnamese came here on family reunification visas. Like Koreans, many Vietnamese immigrants have the language barriers and not to mention the cultural ones to overcome. So life was very difficult, and many of them were actually better off back home, but they lost their wealth either before the trip or during the trip, and in the United States, they started from scratch. Vietnamese Americans, we know, just like Koreans and other Asian groups, they are hardworking and they are very entrepreneurial. And the most noticeable Vietnamese business is nail salons. It seems that nearly half of those nail salons either are owned by Vietnamese or hire Vietnamese technicians. Vietnamese immigrants also start something like a Chinatown, like a Little Saigon. Sometimes a Little Saigon may coexist with a Chinatown. So they start restaurants, they start many other businesses, and also Vietnamese parents are very tough. That's why many Vietnamese students are very good students. Parents very often endure the hardship by working in low-paying jobs, such as assembly lines, but they try to make their children study hard so that the children will do better in America. I have a Vietnamese friend. His father is already 80 years old, but the father has more black hair than I do. It's a very good life because the grandfather and the grandmother encourage the children to study hard. The family now has the first son, my friend, works for TI because the parents want him to start working and get a paycheck as soon as possible. The younger siblings were managed to go to a medical school, law school, or studied accounting. So now it's a very success story. Large family, all kind of professionals. For example, during this time of the year, one daughter will do all the tax returns. And then there's also a dentist in the family. So very successful. I like one Vietnamese business very much. That's called Sugar Bowl Bakery, located in California. Because that company produces the only kind of cookies I like. And then you can go to, it's a French cookie because Vietnam used to be a French colony. So Vietnamese make a very good coffee. they also make very good cookies. So every few days I would visit Tom Sam and I try to get several boxes. It's very good cookies. It's also almost as famous as Panda Express. Okay, I think I will stop here. And then if you have questions, comments. I can hear you.
Thank you, Professor. I just have a question. We know that there are many minorities in America, like African Americans or Latino Americans, who are entitled to some benefits, like high admission rate for universities or subsidiaries. But in terms of population, Asians like Chinese or Vietnamese are more like minorities than those minorities, but why are Asians not entitled with some benefits related to minority? And also in California, I know they are raising up a proposition to SCA 5, which is trying to impose
in California.
Impose the limitation on the admission rate of Asians. So I don't know why we are all minorities, but why we are treated so differently.
Okay, my opinion is that we have to look at the family background, educational backgrounds of immigrants. Immigrants who have better education, better economic status, they could treat their children. They could help their children with schoolwork, so their children tended to do better. But if we just look at their scores or SAT scores, that is a problem, because America has many different ethnic groups, and different ethnic groups have different historical stories. So we must, although we pay attention to SAT school scores, but we also need to consider other factors. I just want to give you one story. In Plano, there are many Chinese American families, and fathers work in high-tech companies, mothers accountants or stay home. And they already got a good education in China or Taiwan. They could tutor their children very well, and the children are well fed. But I also know children, African American children or Latino children. Sometimes they are hungry during the day. But when they are hungry during the day, how can they study? Or if their parents have to work so hard, parents have no time to tutor them. So I think it's necessary to keep a very good balance. We look at scores, look at ranking, look at SAT, but we also need to pay attention to the family background. I can share with you a story. My daughter graduated from Plano High School. I remember several years ago, she came home. She said, there's a Mexican boy, and basically this boy did not eat anything for lunch, because if he would get the free lunch, some people will laugh at him. So he would just tolerate the hunger. So my daughter decided to, for several years, every day she would bring 2 sandwiches, 2 drinks, 2 bags of chips to school. I feel I'm not rich, but I feel my children enjoy many things that the poor children do not. So need to keep a good balance. At this moment, I think UTD has 19% of the students who are Asians. And in some California universities, it's already 30, 40%. So I think to keep a good balance is very important so that we'll make eventually promote diversity so our universities will resemble our society. And also I want to mention something else. We know that many hardworking Mexican migrants, they came here to escape poverty, to find jobs, so they could help their folks back home. But we also know that many Mexican professionals stay in Mexico. They do not come. Actually, there are a lot of rich Mexicans. Their daughters or sons attend very expensive private schools in San Antonio and other places. So I found to keep a very good balance is very important.
Are there other
Thank
questions?
you. I know, yeah.
Questions?
Thank you very
Thank you.